Hi everyone. So here I have my monochromatic painting, and I'm going to show you a little bit of glazing just on this piece. So when you're glazing on top of a monochromatic painting, that process of creating something that's in grayscale and then adding a transparent layer of color on top is otherwise known as grisaille, which is a historical technique that was most commonly used in portrait painting. So I'm going to show you, a couple ways of using transparencies. So I have some transparent tones. I'm going to start with my favorites that I showed you in the last video, which are a little bit of quinacridone magenta and Indian yellow. These are Golden's fluid acrylics, so it's a slightly different consistency than if you have like heavy body acrylics like this. But you can really glaze with anything. You can glaze with heavy body or fluid. It's totally up to you. But I'm just gonna drop out a little bit of each tone. I don't want to overdo it. And I'll also put a little tiny bit of phthalo blue. There's all sorts of other potential tones you could have or tones that you can make, but this sort of triad, phthalo blue, Indian yellow, and quinacridone magenta, are probably going to be the most transparent tones that you have in your palette. So hopefully you have two primary colors or two versions of each primary color, which means you would have a red that leans towards yellow or towards orange, as well as a red that leans towards purple. And same thing with blue and yellow. You would have two versions of it that lean towards opposite sides of the color wheel. But these tones I can mix together to create a variety of different beautiful transparencies. So make a quick green tone, make a quick orange, and a quick purple. It's like a little miniature color wheel I've got here. Move this over a little bit. Okay. So, looking at my image, I definitely want to bring in some of the initial underpainting color, or the color that I used to treat the ground, some of that orange. Mix up a little bit of that. I'm also going to mix in a little bit of my slow dry medium. I really love just putting a little bit of this into most of the time when I paint, I use some of this because otherwise it just dries too fast. And so it's really up to you to get the consistency that you want for what you're trying to do with your glaze. So maybe you want to create a really thin glaze, or maybe a slightly more thick transparency. I really recommend starting out with a pretty thin mixture. That way you can really adjust it as you go. You can let it dry and you can layer on top if you'd like, without quite as much risk. I can also make a really lovely transparent brown tone by mixing a little bit of two complements together. So I have, let's see, basically make an orange and a blue and mix those two together, and it should make a pretty nice brown. And so you could, let's say in this painting I had some shadows that I was missing, some shadows that I didn't quite see earlier on in the process that I still needed to get around to putting in. I could actually just glaze in some shadows. So here I have like a really lovely neutral tone. But what I really want to do is amp up some vibrancy here. I'm also gonna just make a little bit of a nice warm, almost like red oxide color. Okay, so now that I have a variety of some transparent tones mixed up, I can start popping them into my image here. So one of my favorite things about glazing is that you can do it with little risk. So I really like to start out really thin, so that way I'm not really jeopardizing all the hard work I've already put in. So I use a little bit of glazing medium in order to thin out my mixture of whatever color I'm using. And glazing medium is, it's made for glazing, but it can also be used for all sorts of other things. So let's see. I'm just gonna get right into it. So starting with a thin layer, I want to add some neutral orange and some general warmth to the ground. Because I'm interpreting a colorful image into black and white and then adding color, this means that I have some decisions to make, and there's a lot of interpreting going on. I can also have some opportunities to bring in some invented color. Translating color into value can be difficult, but at this stage in the process, you've already done the hardest part, and now you can just have fun by adding transparent layers of color. I'd like the forms that are floating on my tinfoil body of water to be vibrant, so I'm looking back at my diorama for reference. I want to keep a lot of the green-gray neutrals in the background to keep a sort of foggy, atmospheric feeling. This is also an opportunity to correct any moments where you just aren't really enjoying the way that the colors are functioning together, or you feel like they aren't accurately representing what you're seeing. Using a small brush, I'm adding very thin layers of transparent glazed color. As long as I'm using a thin enough mixture of glazing medium and color, this will allow my gradients of value to show through the color, or through this specific layer of color. This will also knock down some of the highlights and lighter tones, as the glaze color will mix optically with the values and the hues that are beneath it. Adding in some slow dry medium can allow you to create fluid gradients from one transparent color into another, which can be really stunning. And I'm going to let my layer of glazing completely dry before I move on to the next step, which will be finishing up my painting with a final layer of opaque tones, using a small brush to add my finest detail. So now I'm going to use my leftover paint on my abstract experimental piece. Notice how the textures will still remain and be visible underneath my layers of color. Every time you layer two different tones, it'll create a third tone that sometimes is really unexpected and exciting. I always recommend having some canvas or gessoed paper laying around to do some experimenting with, because the more you play with your paint, the more fun that you'll have when you want to make something that's more serious or more thought through. In this final painting session, I've mixed up and started to add in with a small brush some vibrant opaque tones, including opaque versions of some of the transparent tones I already used in my glazing process. I'm using a small round brush, and I'm adding more detail in color complexity while also layering in textures. So at a certain point in your painting, I really recommend taking a step back and just asking yourself if the shadows, if the highlights, if how one object sits in front of something else, if it makes sense visually. So I recommend, squint your eyes at it, ask yourself, is this image making sense to me? But also another thing that can help is taking an image of your painting with your phone, just taking a quick picture, and looking at it small on a tiny screen can help you kind of figure out, like, okay, are things actually working out here? Does this object really look like it's sitting on the ground here? Does it really feel like it's on top of this one? I feel like I need to add more contrast between this object and the one behind it. So I'm going to kind of bump the backgrounded object up in value. So I'm going to get rid of some of those extreme low lights in order to allow this part here to stand out as if it's sitting in the front. But taking a big step back and evaluating your work is, one of the most important tools you can learn. And I'm really just having fun with painting opaque tones on top of my glazed layer. So this really lovely lavender tone is actually working really beautifully on top of the Indian yellow glazes, the greener glazes, and my general neutral ground that I've been building up slowly. So I'm really building up a lot of layers. I'm being super patient with this piece. You don't want to rush it, but at the same time, you don't want to stress too much about it being perfect, because there's no such thing as a perfect painting. I like to really kind of ask myself the question, instead of is this good or is this beautiful, I like to ask myself, is this painting interesting? Is it catching my attention in some exciting way? And a lot of the time, even if there's parts of a painting that aren't working or that might look a little weird at first, there can be something really lovely about the mistakes that you're making, but also how you're working through them. So really embrace the process and the fact that mistakes are going to happen. I was feeling really unhappy with this painting before I went through with my opaque layer. I was feeling like my glazing really, I really wasn't feeling like it was adding to the color scheme. But I started to really think like, okay, let's mix up some of the tones that are already there. So one of the big things that I did that I think really amped up the color relationships in this painting was that this first layer that I treated my ground with, this orange, this bright orange tone created with quinacridone magenta and Indian yellow, I mixed up an opaque version of that. So I basically mixed up these two tones, but I added some white to it. So adding white generally will make any tone more opaque, which you can then use hand in hand with the transparent version of it. So the sections where I've done a little bit of glazing with that tone, but also where my first layer, my ground, is peeking through, those work really harmoniously with the sections where I've painted in the opaque version of that color. Another thing you can do is just look for a tone that you see and try to create a transparent version of it. Or try to reach just next to it on the color wheel. So this section of the painting right here, I think, is working really nicely now. This was a section I thought was really not working before. But where I put this Indian yellow glaze here, it really wasn't working. It didn't quite make sense. But as I've gone through and I've started to layer some more chromatic neutral tones, like some of that lavender on top, as well as some various warm and cool purple leaning and red leaning tones, as well as some more greenish neutrals, has really worked nicely. And so I think that there's something to be said for really sticking with a painting, because I thought that I thought I had kind of ruined it after I had gone in and glazed it. Because, a lot of the time our paintings work really nicely as monochromatic paintings. But, taking the risk and going in and glazing and adding more complexity of color, it can really, almost make it so that your painting is in sort of like a new, unfamiliar state that might not make quite as much sense as it did before. And while that can be a little scary or a little bit unsettling at first, because you've been working really hard to create a painting, I really recommend think about it as an experiment, and don't be afraid to push through that feeling. Push through the weird parts of your painting, or the weird layers where things start to get a little hairy and unfamiliar, and keep building up that space, keep building up color, keep adding more and more layers of detail, and it will totally pay off that you took the risk. So, for this project that y'all are doing, if you really push through the moment of taking your monochromatic painting and adding color to it, push through the weird moments and keep working at it. Even if you end up with some mistakes or some things that don't quite work, I will give you a better grade than if you just leave it monochromatic, because it's so important that you try your best, and also take risks in your painting. There's a lot about the painting process that's about making risky moves. You know, when you've been working on something for a long time, it can be kind of scary to take the leap and change it dramatically in some way, like adding color or something. So I really encourage you to, you know, keep working, push through that feeling, but also, you know, just know that it's gonna pay off. Even if your painting ends up looking a little weird, you're gonna have learned way more from the painting if you take that risk and you go through and work through the colors, continually building up layers, and really just let the painting teach you something new. Let the painting show you something you had never seen before. I find that every single painting that I make teaches me more about color, teaches me more about space. And it's also important to remember that every single painting is almost like its own ecosystem in which things are operating within this one world, and we have to really think about how all the relationships are functioning. Is, you know, one section of the painting supporting another? Is the overall color scheme functioning well? And if not, maybe there's one or two objects that you can continue to render, or maybe there's aspects of the background or the foreground that you could continue to render and build up in color in order to balance out other aspects. So while, you know, building up your composition and choosing a successful composition that leads your viewer's eye through the image successfully, while that's one of the earlier stages in making a painting, you can really change things and you can really make or break a painting with its later on layers. So with how you're operating color, with how you're making big decisions and taking risks. So I always recommend, you know, taking a risk with your painting. Worst case scenario, you make a bad painting and who cares? It's a painting. You know, making a bad painting is not the worst thing in the world. I have certainly made a lot of bad paintings in my day. All right, well, I hope you all have a lovely time making your paintings. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, or if you just need feedback, or if there's a specific thing that you're trying to accomplish in your painting and you feel like you aren't quite getting it and you can't quite figure out how. Let me know, and I'm happy to help, give you some tips, because every single painting is different. Like I said, every single painting exists in its own ecosystem. It is its own ecosystem where things are functioning very uniquely with a set of relationships that you need to build up together, which is why we're working from general to specific. So I'm really kind of doing a general pass on the entire painting, in each layer or each step that I take. Well, good luck and happy painting.